Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Roger Zakheim, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, about the health of the U.S. defense industry, the Republican Party's split over Ukraine aid, and American military deterrence around the world. We'll also dive into the future of counterterrorism efforts in Africa, Russia's potential escalation in Eastern Europe, and the looming crisis for America's national security workforce. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent here at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Guy, each week it seems like we've got more and more to talk about here on the national security and foreign policy fronts. But what caught your eye this week?
Hey, Ben, how are you? I want to highlight a couple things off the top before we get to Roger Zakheim. One of the things was this eye-opening UN report that came out claiming that criminals and criminal groups worldwide are raking in some $236 billion a year by forcing people into labor, with sexual exploitation to blame for 3/4 of that take. That's pretty staggering. On another front, the legislature in Hong Kong, the city-state that used to be a full-fledged democracy with real autonomy from Communist Party-ruled China, is now packed with CCP loyalists, and last week it pushed through yet another national security law granting the government sweeping powers to quash dissent. This was widely seen as the cementing of a years-long crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. That crackdown really gained momentum when Beijing pushed the first national security law through 4 years ago. Remember, there were massive street demonstrations for months when that happened. Those are not happening anymore. Another thing that caught my eye in recent days is that Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the Philippines last week, and he gave a speech affirming the U.S.'s, I quote, ironclad commitment, end quote, in the event of a military clash between the Philippines and China. There's been a lot of tension in the South China Sea between Filipino and Chinese naval Coast Guard vessels in recent weeks. This whole situation reminds me of a trip that I made to the Philippines in 2017 at the start of the Trump administration. At the time, Donald Trump was cozying up to then Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte and was doing a lot of saber rattling with China. I actually went at the time and visited Olongapo, the city around Subic Bay, which for many years in the 20th century was the site of the largest U.S. military base overseas. That was the case until the U.S. pulled out. The U.S. military pulled out 30 years ago. I was writing about the prospect that U.S. forces might reestablish the base. Of course, more recent years have actually seen the U.S. taking steps to rebuild the American military posture in the Philippines. And now it seems as if President Biden's relationship with Philippine President Bongbong Marcos Jr., is advancing what Donald Trump had going with Duterte. What's interesting is that Trump and Biden probably hate each other just as much as Marcos and Duterte do, but the U.S.-Philippine military alliance is doing just fine. So is the economic relationship between the Philippines and the United States. Remember that Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was there in Manila at a major business conference announcing new U.S. investment in microchip manufacturing industry and packaging and whatnot. just a week before Blinken was there.
We're going to cover a lot of ground here early in the Threat Status podcast because I'm going to move to a different corner of the world. I want to drill down quickly into something that happened in Africa last week, in Niger specifically. And there were alarm bells in some national security circles in Washington and around the world when news broke that the ruling military junta in Niger apparently wanted the nearly 1,000 American U.S. military personnel to leave. And that's a big deal, of course, because Niger is home to a key U.S. drone base that's become a pretty critical component of America's ability to conduct counterterrorism missions all across Africa, a continent, by the way, that a lot of analysts believe is quickly supplanting the Middle East as the epicenter of Islamic terrorism around the world. And you might remember, Guy, back in October 2020, U.S. Special Forces conducted a rescue operation to free Philip Walton, an American citizen who was kidnapped by armed men in Niger and then moved across the border to Nigeria. A lot of those details of the mission, remain classified, but it was pretty clear right away that America's military assets in Niger, which of course borders Nigeria, were a key to that mission. So where are we today? Now, some Pentagon officials are kind of sort of trying to downplay what the military junta in Niger is asking for. They're saying that, look, they told us that the agreement we have is null and void, but they're actually not demanding that U.S. military forces, pack up and leave overnight. So things are kind of in flux with that. But here's where it gets interesting, Guy. U.S. Marine Corps General Michael Langley, the head of U.S. Africa Command, told Congress last week that Russian disinformation has played a huge role in why Niger and its ruling military junta is suddenly acting this way. And that's one of the reasons I love this podcast so much, guys. We get a chance to dig into some pretty geopolitically complex issues. Apparently, a Russian disinformation campaign in Africa, which we've talked about many times before, seems to have impacted an African government's opinion of the U.S. and its military, which subsequently means that America's counterterrorism capabilities in Africa could be compromised. So this is serious stuff. And after everything we've seen over the past 10, 15 years with Russian disinformation, do we have an effective way to counter it, Guy? Because it seems like in some corners of the world, Russia's obviously able to influence public opinion and government actions in a serious way.
It's a great question. I am trying to figure that out. I want to point out that Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Molly Fee, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Celeste Wallander, and AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley were actually in Niger on March 12th and 13th, apparently meeting with the junta or trying to. And the State Department it's not clear what ultimately came of that meeting. I do want to mention, and this is a shout out on the podcast because it would be amazing if Molly Fee would like to come on and talk with us. She is an interesting diplomat at State. You'll remember that she was the point person in early negotiations in Qatar with the Taliban during the Trump administration. She's a career diplomat. So it's the Biden administration is tapping its diplomatic resources and defense resources, the really good personnel, to try and figure this out.
And we're going to get into the situation in Niger and broader questions about Russia with our guest, Roger Zakheim. And we're joined now by Roger Zakheim. He is the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute. Roger, thank you so much for joining us here on the Threat Status podcast. I wanted to ask you first about the National Security Innovation-Based Report Card that the Reagan Institute just put out last week. The report card gave an F to the federal government for its inability to provide sufficient and stable funding. And now the report card definition of an F is, quote, catastrophic area of weakness. I'm wondering if you can tell us why that is. Take us inside sort of the military and national security industries and explain to listeners how and why budget uncertainty on Capitol Hill translates into real tangible weaknesses in America's global standing and its edge over competitors like China.
Yeah, and the F, ironically, no one has taken us to task for that grade. Ben, it's amazing. They've got an F, and everybody seems to be saying, that makes sense. And that's
no pushback from them on that.
Not yet. And part of it is classic Washington, where if you engage, as we did the other day with senior officials from the Department of Defense, They point to the Congress. And if you talk to the Congress, well, it's the Biden administration that's underperforming or other issues. But the reason why it's so catastrophic is, as you asked the question, since 2011, there have been over 2,000 days where the Department of Defense has operated under a continuing resolution. That's just one metric. I even got not returned the fact that they've been funded at levels, below kind of inflation. So you've had real cuts to defense. And what that means is that our military, which at one point was a superpower that could reach every corner of the earth and dominate in the key regions of the world, right now is shrinking to the point where it's becoming a regional force. And dollars and cents have everything to do with that.
Roger, is that making it very difficult for high-end prime defense contractors to figure out how to move forward on sophisticated projects like hypersonics?
Yeah, great question. It is making it difficult for everybody involved. Hypersonics is especially difficult because that's the sort of thing there isn't a commercial market for. And we're not at the point where we're getting a hypersonic civilian aircraft that's going to move the three of us to some part of the world, right? But that is critical in terms of military competition and the types of threats we are facing from the likes of the People's Republic of China and Russia. And let's be clear, Russia has already employed hypersonic weapons. We had the Deputy Secretary of Defense yesterday at the Reagan Institute during our summit where she referenced that. Now, we may not need hypersonic weapons to deliver our munitions. We may have other means to get in there, but we sure as hell need a capability to defend against hypersonics entering our airspace and protecting the homeland.
I was at the 2023 Reagan National Defense Forum this past December. What an amazing event. There's so many defense community leaders from Secretary Austin on down. It's such a beautiful setting, and the event, the stuff that goes, it's a hot room on the nights at the end of the panels. I was really struck this year by the palpable presence also of new high-tech private sector partners at the forum, particularly AI companies. I wonder if you might reflect on that for us. It was almost like a watershed moment in the convergence between Silicon Valley and the U.S. defense industrial base. Is that accurate? Is there such a convergence actually happening right now?
Thanks, Guy, and I appreciate the kind words about the defense forum. I'm so glad you were able to be out there. I think you're spot on. It was a bit of a breakout year. Now, we've had tech companies enter the Reagan National Defense Forum for years, but there was something qualitatively different this year. I'll give you one example. We had Alex Carr from Palantir, and of course, Palantir just won, along with others, the Titan program for the Army. So stuff's happening in terms of procurement and the military getting more comfortable with engaging tech actors. But what set it off for me is that we had the Air Force Secretary on stage next to the CEO of Anduril, another one of these, it can't really call emerging companies, but a new tech company dedicated to national defense. And they were comfortable sitting next to each other. Let me take you back to 2019, which is also an important moment for us. The Defense Forum is, as you know, we've been doing it for about a decade. 2019, we had Jeff Bezos come to the Reagan National Defense Forum, and we wanted him there for a reason, because you had this Project Maven fiasco where Google workers had declined to work in support of U.S. national defense, and in this case, an intelligence program. And Jeff Bezos came to the Defense Forum and told everybody on stage that Amazon was an American company, that this was somebody who was always going to be committed to national defense. That was a key moment in 2019 to set a message. It's playing out in reality, as you saw at the Defense Forum this past December.
How important is it to Replicator? We talk about Replicator on the podcast. This is the as yet difficult to define term that the Pentagon has put out about the transition towards AI-oriented defense. How important is that convergence to, or just the idea of tapping futuristic private sector ingenuity to the rejuvenation of the U.S. defense industrial base, especially at this moment of great power competition with China?
Yeah, Guy, you're right to highlight Replicator. Yesterday, we had, as I mentioned, the Deputy Secretary of Defense here at the Reagan Institute. She gave fantastic remarks in something perhaps you want to get into now or a later time, where she came to a summit on innovation, but talked about the industrial base and talked about manufacturing. Surprised me a little bit. What she did not say, did not raise in her remarks at all, was Replicator. which of course she has in many respects kind of staked her career, certainly her time as deputy secretary, on this program. So I asked her about it when we sat down, still very focused on it. It brings in, as you mentioned, AI, autonomy, and this idea that in 18 to 24 months, she announced it this past August.
We're talking about Kathleen Hicks, obviously.
That's correct. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, she said in 18 to 24 months, Guy, back in August, the Department of Defense was going to deliver this suite of autonomous, perhaps attributable systems. And she's standing by that. And the other point she made is like, if Ukraine can do this, and as you both are aware, Ukraine has produced anywhere between 1 million to 2 million drones. Being a nation, small nation, at war with a big nation, the United States ought to be able to do the same thing in the same time period. So she's not backing down from it. And many of the reasons why it's important, Guy, she reflected on yesterday too.
Before Ben goes, I was just going to say we were one of the papers, the Washington Times, that helped break the story that there was going to be a huge replicator conference early in 2024. We still don't know when it is. We're kind of watching that closely.
Well, there's been a lot of skepticism about whether or not she can deliver it, and I keep on encouraging your colleagues at times to press on it, to hold them accountable, because we should be counting the days, the weeks, and the months, because 24 months is past August. We should see this stuff fielded. That's what they promised, and we should hold them to it.
Roger, you mentioned Ukraine. I want to ask about the split in the Republican Party right now over Ukraine, and how much aid, if any, to keep providing to Ukraine, and what strings, if any, the U.S. should attach to that aid. For example, some Republicans want to see a firm plan to end the war before they agree to give Kyiv any more money, any more weapons. Where do you think Ronald Reagan would have come down on this debate, and how important is it right now for the Republican Party to stand with Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm usually hesitant to say, what would Ronald Reagan do, or what would Ronald Reagan say? But in this one, it's very clear. He'd be on the side of freedom. He'd be on the side of the nation that's willing to fight for its own freedom. In the case of the Ukrainians, it's been over 30,000 dead. And then they're fighting against a tyrant autocrat that has carried out this aggression against his population. So Reagan's approach to this, you don't have to be a scholar or a master of the history to know where he would come down on it. In terms of the Republican split, Ben, it is split, but it's not an even split. And we do our Reagan National Defense Survey on this. The majority of Americans, the majority of Republicans want to see Ukraine supported. They want, particularly Republicans, to make sure that we're giving them our platforms and munitions to let them fight, not to give them our dollars and to help on the economic side. Leave that to Europeans. If you frame it in that fashion, Ben, it's the overwhelming, a supermajority of Americans that want to see Ukraine supported.
How do you think this, I mean, none of us know, obviously, but do you see a way that this war ends? A guy is probably sick of hearing me say this, but I'm always struck that early on during the conflict, the administration said this is going to end at the negotiating table and we have to get Ukraine in the best possible position when that day arrives. Is that still the best approach for America in your view? That how do we get this to the negotiating table where Ukraine has the most leverage?
I have no problem with a negotiating table, provided that, Ben, it's what you described, that it advantages Ukraine, the side of freedom, the country here where right resides with. So how do we get there? Give them the means to win. And that's where the Biden administration has absolutely floundered. They have been self-deterred. You can even listen to the National Security Advisor speak about the decision-making as it relates to Ukraine, and they deterred themselves. The notion that somehow Russia, Putin talks about tactical nuclear weapons and it results in us cowering and ratcheting it down and not giving Ukraine ATACMS, F-16s, other sorts of platforms that can have them win is ridiculous. That allows Russia to take the advantage and win with nuclear brinksmanship. There are other ways to deal with it. The United States needs to respond to Russian nuclear blackmail by saying it's not going to be tolerated. And certainly it's not going to be the sort of thing where we'll allow them to rape their way through Ukraine.
You've done a lot of work, Roger, on Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm curious to kind of ask you about America's broader standing in the world right now. Afghanistan, of course, is back under Taliban control after 20 years of U.S. presence there. Iraq seems to want our troops out. The ruling junta in Niger recently said they want our U.S. troops and the drone base that we have there gone. We've tried to set up counterterrorism bases in Central Asia to help us go after Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Not a whole lot of success, not a lot of takers. What's going on here? We often talk about America's network of friends and allies as being one of our greatest strengths, but are we losing that? Are we losing influence? And if so, how do we turn it around?
Well, listen, we're living in an era of lost deterrence. And Ben, that's the story of the Biden administration, starting with Afghanistan. The shameful dishonor that played out in Afghanistan with the loss of American lives, with giving Afghanistan back to the Taliban, the world takes notice. And those who want to work with us think twice. And those who feared us now feel that they could take advantage of us. That's what we've seen over the past few years. We have lost deterrence. And as a result, people are not going to take a risk to work with us. So it started with Afghanistan. It continued through Ukraine, and we're seeing it with the Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan Straits. And now, as you point out, Ben, it's playing out in other places. Listen, the United States still has a comparative advantage where it comes to allies and partners. Meaning, if I had a choice between joining up with Team USA or Team China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela, it's quite clear, Team USA, you're better off. But we need to work for that.
Roger, I love it. We're living in an era of lost deterrence. This is, someone could create a good business making T-shirts with that on it. I know you added your criticism of the Biden administration there. I want to ask you as we wrap up here, how should the U.S. judge in 2024 whether or not it needs to commit its military forces to a conflict? I'm asking within the context of Iran and China specifically. Recent weeks, months, really, we've seen U.S. military forces bombing the Houthis in Yemen. We see Secretary of State Blinken in the Philippines saying the U.S. will stand by its military treaty ally in Manila in the event of a clash with China. We've also repeatedly over the last 2 years heard Biden say, but sort of walk back, that the U.S. would support Taiwan in the event of an invasion by China. How do you make that judgment given the politics surrounding all of it?
Well, listen, words are one thing, action is another matter. And the self-deterrence we've seen from the Biden administration would give me pause supporting any kind of military action. Overwhelming force, not a fair fight. Those are the principles that should be driving any situation where U.S. armed forces are put in harm's way. Unfortunately, the leadership of Joe Biden, president, is not someone that has convinced this country, the citizens here, as well as our adversaries, that he's willing to do whatever it takes to win. And if you're not doing what it takes to win, there's no reason to go into armed conflict. It's immoral.
Roger Zakheim, thank you so much for joining the Threat Status Podcast. It was great.
Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, gentlemen. Great to be here.
And of course, if things in Russia weren't complicated and messy enough already, last week's terrorist attack at a rock concert in Moscow, which killed well over 100 people, adds an entirely new dynamic here. We spoke on the show recently about the renewed threats from ISIS-K, the Islamic State's Afghan affiliate, which claimed credit for the attack in Moscow. It's a clear demonstration of what U.S. military officials and analysts have been warning about for months, which I wrote about recently for the Washington Times, and which Guy and I have covered here on the podcast. ISIS-K is getting stronger, more motivated, and they're doing it quickly. And Russia just tragically experienced that firsthand. How Putin responds is going to be fascinating. Some Russian officials are already blaming Ukraine for this. Does the Kremlin lash out against Ukraine after the ISIS attack? A lot of questions here, not a lot of answers yet. But once again, terrorism is back at center stage in world affairs. I want to talk about something that Roger mentioned, this idea of deterrence. Roger just said we're living in an era of lost deterrence. In Ukraine, the administration repeatedly, of course, has been reluctant to send HIMARS, ATACMS, F-16s, any number of things that the Ukrainians have been asking for. They've held off for weeks, months in a lot of cases, then in most cases eventually decided, okay, we're going to send Ukraine what it's asking for. But the common denominator in the delay always seems to be that we're afraid of escalation with the Russians. We don't want things to get worse. God forbid we don't want a nuclear exchange in Eastern Europe. But meanwhile, the Russians have continued to escalate the conflict. So I do think at this point it's fair to wonder, is this approach, at best, a misreading of world affairs and misjudgments about your adversaries, or at worst, maybe just a failure, a foreign policy failure by the Biden administration, because American deterrence has been a pretty crucial tool for a long time in the country's foreign policy and national security toolkit. But if it's clear to folks like Vladimir Putin that we're not actually willing to deter with force when push comes to shove, and if we're continuously and publicly fretting about escalation and what that might mean, what's somebody like Putin supposed to take away from that? You have to be careful, because this approach can allow your enemy to set the pace of a war. So, Guy, do you think, is Roger Zakheim right? Have we sort of lost some of our ability as Americans to deter our adversaries around the world?
It's absolutely debatable. I'm not dodging it, Ben. I more want to point, though, to just the issue of proliferation of nuclear weapons at a moment when the United States, through successive administrations, has not been able to lead anything on the START treaty or the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia or China. So it's almost as if the whole issue of deterrence on the nuclear front or on the strategic front is just sort of sliding off to the side, and we're seeing more proliferation. But when you ask this question within the context of Russia and Ukraine, let's kind of look at what's gone on in the last week with Russia. Vladimir Putin's victory in Russia's election a week ago propels him to another 6-year term in control of the Kremlin. The fact that that election was held amid Putin's ongoing and increasingly aggressive crackdown on opposition has gotten a lot of attention. What hasn't is how Putin announced right after the voting that he now aims to create a buffer zone in Ukraine. I read it as an indication that Russia may be in the midst of a dramatic offensive in Ukraine. We saw last week that Russian forces carried out their first major missile strikes on Kiev in nearly 2 months. Those strikes were then followed by a wave of Russian drone and missile attacks on the electrical grid in cities and towns across Ukraine, leaving a lot of the country without power. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky actually said afterwards that more than 60 Russian drones and 90 rockets were used in the electrical grid strikes. That was last Friday. We'll be keeping a close eye on it to see whether this offensive grows.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week. It's our weekly segment where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners, the American people. Guy, my threat of the week this week is workforce challenges inside the national security sector, and specifically aerospace and defense, or A&D. Earlier in the show, we discussed the Reagan Institute's National Security Innovation Base Report Card, which is a pretty fascinating document, and I'd encourage everyone to go check it out at WashingtonTimes.com. As we discussed with Roger Zakheim, the federal government got an F, which didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me is that America's talent base, its national security workforce and potential workers, got a D. And that's actually down from a D plus in last year's report card. So it's trending in the wrong direction. And when you dig into the details, you can see why pretty quickly. Just a few things. Number one, there's a retirement bubble coming. The report card points out that the A&D industry is graying, with 31% in or nearing retirement age, compared to 16% in the tech industry and 24% in the U.S. workforce overall. Talent availability is declining in the states that attract most defense spending dollars. That means there's fewer workers in the states where the jobs are. And the jobs are taking longer to fill. The average length that a job in A&D was posted online, or was essentially available to be filled, has gone up by 25% over just the last 5 years. People are leaving aerospace and defense to go work elsewhere. There's a lot more detail about why in the report, but here's one reason: the length of time it takes to get through bureaucratic red tape. One example, the onboarding of PhDs, people with a PhD, into jobs in the Pentagon still takes an average of 6 to 9 months. Some people just aren't going to wait that long, especially if you're weighing other offers, you have a family to support, what have you. So there's been some progress on this front, I think, Guy, but we could probably still dedicate an entire episode to security clearance backlogs and the like. So this is a threat because we're at a moment where we need all the talent that we can get working in these industries. And for a variety of reasons, it's getting harder to get them in the door and to keep them there.
I'm going to go a little bit more doomsday. I'm going to start by saying that the rise of artificial intelligence is fueling new threats to U.S. elections. American spy agencies are reaching out to more and more private sector cyber partners to thwart the threat of foreign interference in elections. There's a lot of evidence that private talks between U.S. government agencies and social media companies, the social media giants like Facebook, Meta, right? That's really broken down over the past few years. There is growing interaction between the U.S. intelligence community and private cybersecurity companies. Morgan Adamski, who has actually led the NSA's effort to build up its so-called Cyber Security Collaboration Center, which started in 2020 as a venue for U.S. spies to turn over their unique insights to trusted technology companies. He was at an event hosted in Washington last week by the private cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. Threat Status's own Ryan Lovelace was there covering when Adamski told the crowd that there are now over 1,000 different partners working with the NSA through 800 collaboration platforms on countering the threat of cyber attacks. This suggests the NSA is massively worried about the prospect of a major cyber event. So my threat of the week is that of a 9/11 style cyber attack.
On that optimistic note, probably not the last time that cyber attacks and AI will make an appearance on Threat of the Week, as I promised last week. So we're going to keep our eye on that issue and all of the related issues that we've talked about this week. It's been a great episode, Guy. Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week for the next episode of the Threat Status Podcast.